Hi, welcome to Sociology 336, Sociology of Work and Technology. This is Week 8, Lecture 1. This week, we're learning about how technology shapes work in the information or knowledge economy. This continues on from last week. If you couldn't guess, based on the readings for this week and the previous week, these are about workplaces similar to those that you might enter in the near future, or about workplaces upon which you depend, even if you might not ever work there. So, for example, this week we're discussing some workplaces that might very well be like those that you enter after university. But last week, we read about labor power that you depend on. The labor power exerted by the South Asian workers described in last week's readings. And so you, as a citizen of the world, are implicated in the conditions of their work. So in the first reading for this week, we're looking at how information technology structure knowledge. This comes from Erica Robles-Anderson, who is Associate Professor of Media Culture and Communication at New York University in New York City, and Patrick Svensson, who is a fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies. We've already learned about how techniques and technologies impact skill in industrial workplaces, something we read about in Zuboff and Braverman earlier in the course. But what about jobs in the service sectors, especially knowledge workers or cognitive laborers who use things like PowerPoint, Word, Outlook, and other pieces of software to convey information? On one hand, those workers tend to be more autonomous. That autonomy is something we read a bit about in Boltanski and Chiapello's study of managerial ideology, or the new spirit of capitalism. We read that last week, right? So remember, bureaucracies are in decline and have been for years, though of course, places like Queens, where I work, and government institutions are bureaucracies, but because of the decline in bureaucratic organizations, we find that workers are more autonomous, which isn't such a bad thing at all. But that doesn't mean that structure is absent from work. On one hand, there are new modes of organizing work, algocracy that we read about before, as well as the sort of autonomy that lacks safety that was described by Boltanski and Chiapello. But in addition to that, technology structures how we think, how we convey information, and what information we should focus on while we're at work. Here, technology shapes not only the skills we need and the skills that are valued by employers, but technology shapes how we perceive information used to make decisions at work. Think about even in your own lives as students. Think about how much you expect presentations of any kind to fit the format of a PowerPoint slideshow, and how often you all demand the use of slides. Rather than simply listening to a speaker or depending upon lessons that are written on chalkboards or whiteboards. It wasn't so long ago, 20 years ago, that PowerPoint wasn't quite as ubiquitous, although it was certainly available. This is fairly recent, and what I want to highlight here is that technology, or PowerPoint in particular, has become an infrastructure that you've come to rely upon in your learning. But of course, if we take that into consideration, crucial lessons that we learned from Grint and Woolgar along with Judy Weissman, then we know that one technology, in this case PowerPoint, is not inherently better than older forms of slide presentations. Different technologies simply afford different possibilities. You simply come to expect PowerPoint, but it doesn't necessarily improve your learning or make lessons any more clear. In fact, it could even be detrimental. PowerPoint's centrality as an infrastructure of knowledge, in fact, has potentially dire consequences. These are described in the reading when talking about government institutions, and certainly in large corporations. So how does technology shape how we know what we know and how we think about what we know? Well, Erica Robles-Anderson and Patrick Svensson think that our knowledge is shaped by the formal affordances of technology. Put differently, the design of technology, along with its features, shape how we convey information And this, in turn, shapes how we learn and shapes our expectations for learning inside organizations. How information is presented is equally important to what information is presented. Or to quote, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And in fact, their argument isn't too different from other media scholars that talk about how particular mediums or particular genres conform to certain expectations and actually teach us to expect certain things. And that in turn shapes how we understand things, right? And places certain limits on how we can understand things. As Robles-Anderson and Svensson explain, PowerPoint is one of the most widely used ways of transmitting information within workplaces around the world. PowerPoint enables us to construct presentations with a lot of ease, but it also presents that information in ways that prohibit alternate modes of presentation. So, how does PowerPoint structure knowledge? Well, first, PowerPoint only allows one slide to be presented at a time, and also promotes hierarchical linear organization of information. When combined, these two affordances of the software make it so that conflictual ideas cannot be presented side by side. They have to be presented in sequential order. Second, PowerPoint organizes that information so as to obscure any kind of inner conflict within the information as presented. Right, so you have the inability to present two ideas as equal to each other. They have to come one right after each other and or be organized in a hierarchical fashion. So it's very difficult to present two ideas as being equal, or to contemplate two ideas simultaneously. So it reinforces that way of thinking, a linear hierarchical mode of thinking, which trains us to think in a very particular way and trains us to expect things to be presented in a very particular way. If you take other classes, you'll learn that way, that linear hierarchical mode of thinking, is a particularly Western European way of understanding how information should be organized. And so PowerPoint reproduces that, and thus reproduces that in the structure of how we interpret things. That's what they're arguing here, right? Or you could extrapolate that that's something that they're arguing. Second, PowerPoint organizes this information so that it seems like a false whole, a false unity, that leads most viewers to treat a slide as true, even if it's conveying false information. So, for example, all evidence of PowerPoint's constructedness, such as boxes around text or red lines that indicate misspelling, are hidden when you go into presentation mode. I also want to point out one other thing, just to tie this to earlier readings about technology and skill. Now, Robles-Anderson and Svensson don't make this argument, but it's, I think, there for us to interpret if we think about previous readings. And this is the kind of work that you really need to be able to do in the essays to get a good grade. So I'd like to point out, if you recall Braverman and Zuboff, they talked about techniques and technologies that de-skill workers or render worthless previously valuable skills. PowerPoint does this well. As shown in the reading, slide presentations used to require a number of different sorts of workers, kind of a quite elaborate division of labor. This included typesetters, designers, photographers, printers, and projectionists. Now, all the work of building a presentation is done by one worker. Additionally, the skills required for those other positions are devalued, or in most cases, simply not worth very much. So these older readings regarding de-skilling and technology, they continue to be relevant with some modification. They can be extended to discuss these new phenomena, even though they don't talk about PowerPoint at all. Next up, we'll be reading a bit more from Judy Weissman, along with a short op-ed from Melissa Gregg on the issues of time, autonomy, and information and communication technologies. I'll see you then.